Okay, so what I'm going to do next is simply highlight some elements that I think as scientists we need to begin to deal with, because they are part of some of the things where I think science has not been able to achieve its real goals in dealing with sustainability. And one of those, but there I have to tell you also that I'm an archaeologist, so 10,000 years for me is nothing. But we need to take much more into account the long term of what we're doing. The long term allows a number of things. It allows to take into account in the system those things that move very slowly, and that is really important. And they are not only natural, they are also social. Societies change over millennia. And one of the important drivers that most science and social science don't think about is second order change. That is the change of how things change. That in itself is a dynamic which reconfigures our societies, but because it happens very slowly, it is very often not even sort of acknowledged. So then the question is, can we identify the long-term societal drivers of human-environment relations? And I will get back to that in one of the next couple of slides. The result what we have is the co-evolution of information processing, cognition, technology. By the way, technology in my terms is a tool for information processing because it reduces the complexity of decision making by having tools that shape the decisions for us. Sustainability is as currently used, and that is a really interesting domain, particularly I think in a country like Japan. It is the future production of an ideal. I once read a Chinese text, not in Chinese of course, but nevertheless, who contrasted Judeo-Christian beliefs with the ancient Greeks. And the contrast is really illustrating because the Judeo-Christian tradition sets an ideal in the sense of Christ or God or whatever. And then it tells people to behave like that ideal. The Greeks do the opposite. The ancient Greeks did the opposite. They defined the gods like people. They shot each other and they had love affairs and they made all kinds of trouble. Now the question is, well, sustainability as a concept is also sort of a vague ideal out there. And one of the things that we need to take into account, I think, is that it actually is, that it is almost ungraspable. And that is where I have learned a lot over the last few years, being both in China and here, of, for example, a Taoist vision that doesn't create an ideal like that, but actually says, okay, you're here and now, do the best you can with the here and now, rather than set a goal that is distant and moving. So that, I think, is one challenge. So much current work in all of our Western science is based on an Aristotelian approach which actually assumes that stability is the norm and that change is a disturbance of stability. Now there was another philosopher in ancient Greek, Heraclitus of Ephesus, who argued the opposite. And he basically said, change is everywhere. And it is humans who create a semblance of stability. Once we start combining those two views, I think we come much closer to getting a real sense of what is going on. The other aspect to that, which is not on this slide, but I will mention it briefly, is the fact that all of science always talks about feedbacks, but it rarely ever talks about anticipation or feed forward. Humans anticipate, and I'll get back to that in a moment. So that is another one of those flip-flops that I think we need to think about. Now I'm in the next two slides summarizing those for the relationship between the environment and humanity, and for past, present, and future. And I will summarize them rather than go through them. But there is very interesting work done by a team of cognitive scientists in California that basically says, once we are confronted with an environment that we don't know, we create categories. Thank you very much. We create categories, and we do that by looking at the similarities between the phenomena that we see. And once we've created those categories, we try and define what does not belong in those categories. And in order to do that, we essentially look mainly at the differences between the category and other things. Well, if you project that on the relationship between milieu and environment, milieu is a situation where humanity is compared to nature. The environment is the referent, and what is in the middle of the environment is that milieu. That's why it's called milieu. And that means that the referent is, and the relationship between subject and referent are one way. Once we talk about the environment, we take humanity as the center and as the referent, and the environment actually becomes the outside that we compare to. The end result of those two is that in the milieu perspective, natural changes tend to be viewed as dangerous because they're beyond human control. Whereas in the environment perspective, the opposite is the case. Natural changes seem more controllable and lose their dangerous appearance. Now, if you think about those two perspectives in interaction, which is what happens when humans relate to whatever they consider their environment, those two things reinforce each other. And that is one of the reasons that our society permanently is aggressive towards nature, because it thinks that its actions are more controllable than nature's actions. That is a very, very heavy mortgage on our relationship with nature. Because if we were to invert that, we would automatically adopt the precautionary principle, which again, I can't go through the whole argument here, but that is what would happen. And so the question is, it is very Western to actually look at these categories in this particular way. And should we continue to do that? Should we not look much more at the balance between the two, rather than at the separation between nature and society? Should we not look at their interactions? Okay. The same goes for time. And I'm not going to go through that a lot, but I'm basically saying, if you compare the present to the future changes seem dangerous. What is this? No, I don't want any sugar. No, this is fine. Thank you very much. It's okay. I can't have any sugar. So, sorry you guys, this is a little interruption. Anyway, so in that case, the future changes seem dangerous because they're beyond control of the present. If the present is related to the past changes seem controllable and use their dangerous appearance. This is very important because it explains why we look at the past by creating change of cause and effect that we think are controlled and are the reality. But of course, the past is just as uncontrollable as the future is. And so we need to begin to look at those aspects of how we think about the past and about the future. This applies and is an argument that I particularly often develop with modelers who have a sense of that they know how the future is going to be, which I think is not always very realistic. So, I'm going to jump over this. I'm going to basically say another aspect that we need to deal with is the relationship between sustainability and unsustainability. As sustainability is an ideal, sustainable and unsustainable are both time-bound. What is really important is in our relationship with our environment, when we make changes, we make them based on a very limited perception of that environment. We acknowledge some things that we see, and we then want to do something about them. But the actions that we take relate to a very wide range of processes that we don't even know. And so what you get is that over time, all these unknown processes, unanticipated consequences, actually create new problems. And so one paper that I wrote about this, that I think I presented here a couple of years ago, is basically called Solutions Cause Problems, rather than the other way around. Okay. Then I already talked about the limitations of perception. What that does in the end is actually create these kinds of tipping points, which are here symbolized by the work of René Thom, who basically argues that when a system goes up, where is it? Oh, I got to go like this. When a system goes up like this, and it keeps going, then ultimately, because of the shape of the surface on which it operates, it actually falls off the edge. That is what we call a tipping point. That is what is happening to our environment. We have acted in a particular way, and we are now about to fall off the edge. So then I want to make a brief conclusion, and that was what I wanted to be the tail end of this course, because it is also what opens for me the discussion that I want to have with you, is that you have a very particular culture. And I am not hiding from myself that I see only a very small part of it. But because of a number of you, we have seen, I think, some very essential parts of it. And the impression that it gives me is that you have preserved, notwithstanding the American pressure after the Second World War, the core of your cultural ways of thinking. And I think that core is a really important tool to help the world change the way it has its science and the way it is going. And I'm just giving a couple of examples that struck me and that I sort of, over the last couple of days, figured out that I could say. One trip that we made in 2013 with Abe-san was to Tohoku. And we saw the disaster. And we saw and talked to people. And one of the things that stuck with me more than anything else is people saying that the community is more important than the individual. I've never heard that in America. I've never heard that in Europe so strongly expressed. I think the sense of community that you have in some parts of this country, and I'm not in any way hiding from myself the fact that there is lots of other stuff going on, is actually a real treasure and something that should be promoted and is being promoted in other countries now, and that is important. One of the things of that is important is that in a community, because you know each other and you respect each other, things are negotiable. They don't have to be accounted for in money. They don't have to be fixed in rules. And Stefan remarked that to me the other day when we were walking over the sidewalk. Bicycles and cars and pedestrians all sort of go about their way. And there is a permanent negotiation between them, which is to some extent controlled by rules, particularly for the cars, but which is less controlled than it is particularly in my home country, where no bicycle can go outside the bicycle path, for example. So that's one thing that I think is an interesting character of this country. Another aspect is the way you deal with nature. I get a sense that there is a much closer relationship and a more respectful relationship between humanity and nature. Anik and I were led into that by an experience in Mongolia. We went to Outer Mongolia in 2013 and saw a country there that is twice the size of France and has only 500 kilometers of road. The rest of it is grass, hills, forest. And people are actually living in nature there. Next year, we went to the Chinese Inner Mongolia, where the environment has been completely destroyed by mining, by industry, and so on and so forth. I get the feeling, and I will show you a couple of slides in a moment, that in this country, yes, people try and control the environment, but they do so respectfully. It is not an opposition. It is not a sense, it is us or the environment. It is a sense of us with the environment, in the environment. And one of the things that was interesting that I experienced here is a lecture of a French gardener with very advanced ideas. Here in Kyoto, this man Clément, who actually thinks about gardens in yet another way, because when he starts a garden, he thinks about what it will look like in 30 years. The English do that to some extent, but most other people don't do that. Another, for me, very important part is how you do agriculture here. Agriculture is not, like in many countries, become something that you could do without any soil. People actually plant in the soil. People have small-scale agriculture. They don't have these huge corporations with 12 combined harvesters that roll over the country. I think that is very, very important because it maintains the relationship between people and the land in a different way. And part of why I'm saying is this because Stephen is sitting right here and he's doing a project on that, which we'll talk about tomorrow. But anyway, I was also very impressed by hearing here actually in Kyoto, Altieri, who is the champion of agroecology, which is a movement that argues that 2/3 of agriculture in the world is still small scale and is still done by local farmers. And he wants to maintain that, and I think he is right about that. And you also see it in a different way, and this is something where I think both France and Japan for me are very important, because people here have a real respect for the quality of their food. In many other places, Britain, America, other places, that is no longer the case. If you have a student or a child in France, and you ask him what a fish looks like, he draws a rectangle because the only thing he ever gets is fish sticks. These are things that I think are symbols and exponents of a very profound relationship to nature, which I think is getting lost in much of the Western world. And the other thing that struck me hugely is, for example, in Koyasan, that people, anybody from any religion, can bury themselves or anything else in the cemetery. There is no obligation to be part of one religion. And I was told, and I can't verify this, that many people in Japan change religion during their lifetime, because for some parts of the religion, births are more important than marriages, and for other parts of another religion, the death is more important and more symbolic. So all I want to try and argue with all of this is that there are a number of treasures that we have discovered in how people in this country relate to their environment and relate to each other, which I think are missing in many parts of the Western world. And that also extends to research, and we are in a research institute, so I have to also mention that a little bit. And Stefan and I had the same reaction at different times, because he's been here only last year for the first time. And that is that our Western sustainability research basically likes to deal with things globally, and is not very good at dealing with it locally or in any detail. Because the way in which you go about it here focuses on the community and focuses on the detailed dynamics of the community and tries to understand those detailed dynamics, you actually create a situation in which you can help a community develop its own ideas rather than some Western corporations' ideas. Right now I have a student in Iceland. And Iceland, after the financial crisis in the country, the government wanted to modernize. So they asked KPMG to make a plan for the country. And now the country is being ruined by dams, by huge electricity plants that serve information technology servers, all those kinds of things, and it's also being overrun by tourism. Do we want all of that? I saw in your part of the workroom, and I don't remember the exact details of it, Stephen, your thing that in feast enough is better than too much, or something of that sort. Yeah, that's right. So what you do here also, which appeals a lot to me, is the developing of a bottom-up approach to sustainability. There are places elsewhere in the world where that happens, but you've made it systematically into an approach that I think contrasts quite heavily with what Western development or sustainability studies actually often do. And so also you ask different questions. You don't set this goal of sustainability that others set. You look at, well, what is locally possible? What can I do to improve the situation? I think those are incredibly valuable and important aspects of what we have learned about this country, and I'm going to illustrate those with a few slides. This is Tohoku in 2013 when Abe-san and Anik and I went there, and Mike Kobayashi. And what is amazing is this cemetery, which is the only part that survives of the town. And if you go down in the center, there is a stone that was erected a number of years ago, probably a century or so ago, that basically says, if you build your houses closer to the sea than that, they will disappear. But of course, everybody built them closer than that, and so everything disappeared. So there is a wisdom there. What I regret, after talking to people in places like this, is that the solution now is not to make people move higher up the mountain, but to actually create a huge concrete wall around much of the country. This is to symbolize the small scale of agriculture. This is a rice terrace near Kochi on the island of Shikoku, where we visited on another occasion. This is what I love as an image about the relationship between people and their environment, because all these trees are being helped to maintain their shape. Whereas in the West, they would hack off all the branches and you would have nothing left. That, I think, is the kind of interaction that we need to revive. This is just a couple of other things that I've found so wonderful. All of these, by the way, are photos that Anik made over the last few years. The first one is the image of the monkey and the koi together is something that I could never even imagine in the Western world. The same goes for the garden of a temple that is very close to here, just around the corner. And then this. One of the things that was very impressive is the role of festivals in this country. And in particular, that came home to us on the right-hand slide at the top there, this one, which is a Kagura festival on the southern island. And what is interesting is the ceremony itself. But what is, to me, much more interesting from an anthropological perspective is when we talk to people, they said, look, why we're doing this is because doing this together as a village gives people an occasion in a structured context to deal with their differences and to deal with their conflicts. And so, in this case, the festival is being used to actually promote the coherence of the society. The left-hand side, the photo from Ise, was another really interesting occasion, because this is taken on the day, once every 20 years, that Ise inaugurates a new temple, which is built exactly the same way as the last one. What I took away from the symbolism of that is that change is the only permanent thing. It always is changed, but it always remains permanent. On the right-hand side is a festival in Nara that we attended as well, and which I simply show because the costumes are so precious and so interesting. Oh, wait, now, I got it, yes. So, I want to put a challenge to all of you. I think that we need to get away from all this Western science. And I think the only way we can do that is actually by looking at the science in this country, the traditional science in parts of East Asia and Southeast Asia. And that also has enabled many technologies in many industries. But something Professor Sugihara taught me in Fukuoka was the difference between evolving the technology by implanting more and more machinery, or actually evolving the technology by using human beings. And I think that is a big distinction. And as I mentioned earlier, with the threat of very large unemployment in Western countries because of automatization, I think this is definitely a way we need to think. And so my sense of it is, but this is a far reach, but because Japan has in such a unique way combined parts of Western culture and parts of its own culture, could it help us in the transition by, to some extent, creating models of how we can tackle some of these things? And I think that is being one of the very important lessons for us here in our visits to RIHN. Because the way you look at sustainability, because of the long-term detailed research you do in communities. And so I think that mediation role is something which, if I were to have any sort of impact, I would love to see this place actually go. Don't forget, it's the only place in the world that is the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature. There is no second one. There are institutes for sustainability, for environmental science, for everything. But there is not anything like that. And so I think one thing, and I've argued this in the past also in the ERIC committee, one thing that would be interesting is to see in how far different language can be developed here to actually deal with these kinds of challenges. And with that, I will end it with another of Anik's photos, simply taken out of the Shinkansen as we were driving by. So thank you for your attention. I am happy to answer questions or whatever you all want now.
Thank you very much, Sander. Let's see if I can operate the lights. We have a little while for some exchange, I think. So I would invite people to raise their hands and ask questions. This is a precious occasion to ask some of the questions of Murasa-san.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I have two comments. First is about, you are saying change and second order change. Likewise, about information. There's information and meta information.
Yeah.
And the difference between chimpanzee and human being is not that level of information. They are changing at the level of meta information.
Yes.
So we should learn how to manipulate meta information in order to have global or environmental issues.
I recognize Gregory Bateson in what you
Yes,
said.
yes. And another comment is just we discussed thinking about ecosystem. We are usually consider our ecosystem outside world, but the same is true at the level of inside world. So after evolution, we have changed climate change so much, but at the same way, we change our health very dangerously. But no one knows how such thing is occurring. So we should learn climate change problem, it is a hint to solve the problem of our health in order to recover from modern illness problems. These are
I wholeheartedly agree, and I would actually even go a step further. I think in information processing, societies have moved a lot of the problems that they encounter from the environment into the society. What you see is with urbanism, for example, and I have not been able to show the slides of that, but once urbanism begins about 4000 BC in the Near East, it's the beginning of all the regulatory mechanisms. And they're regulatory mechanisms to avoid conflict between people, because the environment has been simplified and the society has been complexified.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. So I am always wondering about how can I frame what the Japan or Japanese way of thinking. So some of the point you see the attribute or advantage of the Japan's philosophy, like some people believe the community is more important than individual. So it's a very difficult. The one point is such kind of the notion is changing over the generation. Is one point. And the second thing is those kind of the things are sometimes conflicts with the modern Western human right concepts. So so some people, especially in the young, not only young, both old and young people feel difficult to force the view of the community. Some community force the members to think about their communities more important than individual, but sometimes it's really, how do you say, the barrier for those freedom of living or freedom of working. So how do you think about this conflict?
Okay, well, I think that we are in a process that is to some extent irreversible, in the sense that now people don't depend so much more on their community. They get retirement from the state. They get health insurance. They get all kinds of things that 100 years ago they didn't have. And the only thing that they did have in those days was the possibility for helping each other. And so I think part of the problem, this is very much what the young generation is feeling, they want their freedom. And I understand why they do. But this is also a very interesting part of how our own society has evolved. Because for many, many centuries, the young were given a little bit of freedom, but they could not escape the community. Now they can escape the community. And I don't know how we're going to deal with that. What I do see, and which I don't know enough about your young people here in this country. I know they have been very restless and have been, in many cases, also not wanting to go in this direction. But I still believe that the kinds of ideals that were created in earlier times are really important. And why am I talking particularly about Japan? Because in a lot of developing countries, these ideals are still there. But this is one of the few countries in my own mind that actually bridges those two ways of thinking. Now, I'm not saying that you can do it all, but I do feel that there is something in this country that is very worthwhile bringing to the fore and helping with. And give you another example, which is in Britain. One of the interesting movements in Britain is the transition towns movement. And those people are in some ways doing the same thing. They're basically saying, okay, our city cannot solve all its problems unless everybody in the city participates in trying to solve those problems. So what they're doing there is they're creating a new kind of sense of community. Whereas here, I think that is maybe less so, I don't know. But so I wonder about whether it's possible to sort of, on the one hand, preserve some of these ideals and actually bring them out as ideals for other societies. Yeah? Now I get it.
Yeah, I think you have to think more about your view on Japan.
Yes, I know.
Because you said things are negotiable.
Yeah.
And there is flexibility.
Yes.
And I don't think there is a flexibility because it is not. You have a bicycle
yeah.
or a car or pedestrian share the same space.
Yeah.
It is because they don't disturb.
Yes.
The bicycle doesn't disturb the pedestrian,
Exactly.
And the car the same, you know. So there is a kind of respect, but it is not flexible.
Maybe not.
You have
You may
to
be right.
respect, and I don't think things are negotiable in Japan, you know. There is a rhythm, and for instance, in Ise, they built again and again every 20 years. Do you think there is a flexibility in this? I don't think so.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I accept that I have to think much more about
Yeah,
it.
you
That
have to
I know.
think more. You have to think more. And please don't use the term religion about Japan, because the word doesn't
Okay.
exist in Japanese.
No, you're right.
This is different. There is deities, you know.
Yeah.
It is not God. It is deities.
No, I should have said beliefs.
And
You're absolutely
it is
right.
more a philosophy than a religion.
Yeah.
Because
Agreed.
it is very tolerant from Buddhism or the other
Shintoism.
one. Shintoism, yeah. Yeah. And when you say, you know, Japanese place human at the center, after telling nature and human are linked, they don't place human in the center. They place nature
I
and
didn't
human.
say that.
You write it. I noticed the sentence.
Oh, on the slide?
So.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to change it. Yeah.
Okay, I
So
will
this
change
is
it.
the private debate. Okay. This is
Thank you very much. This is good. Absolutely. Don't fall. Okay.
I'm tempted to leave it at this because it's a nice end. But are there any others who sort of want to?
Okay.
Leah.
Yeah, please. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Some people instead use the word resilience. An advantage of that word is that it is actually a systemic property that you can define. Sustainability is not really something you can define. I think that's one way to think about this. Clearly, the word resilience has also been overused. And I don't think there's right now, any substantive other alternative. And that's part of a problem that we all have in science, because we are a community, things evolve in that community. And so ultimately, no word will ever hold for very long. And so I think what we do with sustainability is we think about a set of things in the relationship between humans and nature, and that's valuable. But in how far the term itself helps us, except draw our attention to it, not so sure. Okay? Okay. Oh, yeah, okay. Daniel, go ahead.
works.
Yeah,
What's interesting in your argument at the end, that you, in advocating for the Japanese method or approach to not sustainability, but something else that we talk about as sustainability these days, that you don't cite science here in Japan. You cite the cultural field, practices, beliefs, rituals, arts, gardening, and things like this. And I understand that, and I feel very sympathetic. But at the same time, in a sense, it's as if you're saying to Japanese science, you need to become more Japanese. But that brings us into the problem, in a sense, of a complete shift in scientific mentality, first. And second, the problem of being able to then bring such different kinds of knowledge into dialogue. Presumably the field of understanding in which this other kind of science would operate would be completely different from that of the Western science, and would have to confront that head on. So, two very big challenges, it seems, that you pose. I just wanted to...
No, I'm very glad you re-accentuate that. I do see a huge challenge there. But compared to the challenge that we're facing globally, it's a lesser one. And I think it can be at least, an important one that in this place you can actually work on, and that is why I was accentuating it. I mean, I could also have taken some of your own work about Japanese crafts as an example that is very, very different from any way these things are happening in Western Europe or in the States or in any of those other countries. And so I do believe those differences, and Anik is right in my formulations, and I gladly take that. But I do believe there are fundamental differences. And I do believe that you have, as a country, suffered to some extent from the late phases of Western colonization in the way the Americans have sort of taken the system here and modified it. And I am arguing, not only in Japan, but in Japan in particular, that it would be worthwhile to think more about the underlying sort of cultural aspects that also influence the science. And I think Professor Murasi is a very interesting example of that. Okay? Yeah, please.
Sande-san, thank you very much for a great lecture for us. I really enjoyed, and I think all of us really enjoyed, and we'll have learned a lot. Actually, I have many questions, comments.
Yeah, please.
I think, there. So to discuss with you, I think you are now the honorable fellow. So I do hope we have more chance to discuss with you in the future now. By the way, this RIHN, yes, thank you very much for giving us very warm words for the RIHN. But we are also facing the challenge, particularly in many aspects. For example, one is, this now half of the researchers here are natural scientists, and about half are the social science and humanities. Yeah. And now we have been now nearly 20 years since the establishment of the RIHN. We still have a very big kind of, the challenge for the dialogue between the humanities community and the natural science community. And so, of course, we have made a very big effort, I believe, through the many projects, so which is very good. But you mentioned about the Western way of thinking versus Japanese way of thinking or the Eastern way of thinking. Yes, I believe that kind of the difference surely exists, and we have to be harmonized between the two.
Yeah.
So in the same sense, I think yes, because you are originally the archaeologist and the anthropologist, but now you have let's say you are also very much interested in or involved in the kind of global change issues too. So I'm wondering all the time, through when I am watching the many projects and activities here, that one is how to say many projects focus on the kind of local issues, as you mentioned, which is very good, to get kind of local sustainability or the solution for locally. But at the same time, how those kind of local issues are connected with the global issues.
Yeah.
That is very, very important. Which we still don't have a good kind of the method or methodology to solve it. So, and also the another side is that humanity's way of thinking somewhat quite different sometimes from the natural science. So. So from your long-term experience, so I do hope your comments or suggestions.
Look, I think part of why I'm making this argument has to do with my own background and my own education, which for the first 18 years was a very unstructured education where I was allowed to learn rather than to be taught. So I grew up in a Montessori education until I was 17. And so I had a lot more freedom in thinking. But there are other elements. There is the fact that archaeology is not a discipline. Archaeology is basically digging and then doing something with it. But there is a particular aspect to that is of importance here. Two aspects. One of them is to do with how archaeology comes to theories. Because archaeology, when you dig, you only recognize what you already know. And you destroy what you don't know. And so it is very difficult in archaeology to actually do anything like falsifying or proving any particular theory. So in archaeology, that means that most of archaeological argument is only based on the internal consistency of the argument and not on the relationship with the data. And then for me, a third element that was really important is that all of the 90s, I actually worked in a team of 65 scientists from every discipline you can think of. We had theoretical physicists, we had mathematicians, we had geoscientists, humanities scientists, historians, hydrologists, everything. And so as a coordinator of that project, I was basically in the incredibly favorable position to have to create intellectual fusion with a lot of those disciplines and to do a lot of the translation between the natural sciences and the humanities. And so that is sort of why I'm having this particular vision. And I am very aware, and have been very aware here, and we have talked about this before, how difficult that actually is. And so I'm not at all trying to belittle the difficulties. I think the difficulties are huge. I'm simply saying I think it's worthwhile doing it and to continue doing it as you have been doing and to maybe see how you could even improve that. So that, I think, for me is the transdisciplinary element. We all use this word transdisciplinary and nobody knows what it means. I have substituted something I've taken from our university president, and that is intellectual fusion. Intellectual fusion between disciplines. And the Western way of going about it, ever since the sort of the Royal Society and the Newtonian approach that was developed in England, is to take a set of phenomena and to divide them up, and then to analyze the subsets. And that has led to a huge fragmentation of what we actually intellectually do. And our university systems, our funding systems, have taken that on board and made that even more extreme. And so the actual possibility of having a more holistic approach is in Western science incredibly difficult to achieve, but is, I think, for sustainability, an absolute necessity. So, yeah, please.
There's no soup today, so it doesn't get cold.
Okay.
Thank you for your lecture. I really enjoyed it. This is a rare occasion in my age to ask student questions. There are a couple of them. It's relatively specific, I hope, for your scope of vision. The first one concerns information, or the more, what Stefan says, the digital, the more recent technology. The question for global history is, do you sense any Western cultural specificity in the development and diffusion of the digital? So that's the first one.
Yes, okay.
The second one is similar, but I think it's more fundamental to my understanding of your background. You have referred to complex systems perspective. I have been at the meeting of Santa Fe Institute and so on, but I have never really understood some of the, the kind of assumptions. I think you have at least struggled with these perspectives for a very long time, and it's probably the best chance for me to understand. So again, do you sense any Western cultural specificity behind that kind of approach?
Okay. First, about the information processing and information technology. I think every culture has its own way of dealing with the information processing. And I'm not talking about the machines and the digits. I'm talking about what it actually means for society, where the society is letting it go, where it constrains it. I think one of the big problems in the Western world is that information processing is now no longer controlled by the public. It's entirely controlled privately. And these people do all kinds of things that you don't even want to know about, but you must know about them. They're really, really dangerous. And so that is one particularity of what I see in the Western way of information processing. Other cultures create also very dangerous things. I mean, I can think about what is happening in China to some extent. But for me, the important thing here is that it is the way the information is processed that actually determines the values of the society. And that is where the society anchors itself and creates its own institutions. So that is one thing. Now, complex systems, yeah, it's true. It's not so easy. I think what helped me a lot is that when I started looking at this theoretically, I also was forced, because of the personal relations I had, to actually make this part of my everyday life. And I think that is to some extent what made me understand some of those things. Now I have a whole PowerPoint that I'm happy to share with you, and I really am happy to share with you about various aspects. I also have some references that might be helpful. And in particular, a book that I really like is by Melanie Mitchell. And Tim, do you remember the title exactly?
It has complexity and then code.
Yes, Complexity and Introduction or something like that. That dates from, I think, 2009 or 2010 or something like that. That is a very legible way of getting it introduced. Another really interesting way is more historical, and that's James Gleick has written a book about complex systems and another book about innovation, and both of those are written for a general public, but they are very good. But I'm happy at some point to actually have a longer discussion about that aspect. If we can find some time where we're both here, I'd be delighted. It's too much to do that now. There are so many aspects. But a couple of the fundamental ones. Much of our science has been trained to explain the present by looking at the past. And so it looks back. Complex systems tries to do the reverse. It looks forward and it tries to grapple with emergence of the new. I think that's a very, very fundamental aspect. And it relates a little bit to what I showed about the relationship between present, past, and future. So that's one way in which I think this is important. And its name, complex systems, for me, and probably not for most of the people involved, has to do with the fact that if you look at things from the past to the future, you have many more dimensions to take into account and much more complexity about the phenomena to take into account than you do when you look back. Because as I showed, when you look back, you think that you've found a nice, simple way through time, but you've found that by eliminating a whole bunch of the difficulties. And as a historian, which you are, I think you are very aware of that particular problem. More talk. Okay.
Je crois que je dois te demander en français,
Oui,
parce que mon
absolument,
anglais n'est pas
pas de
assez bon.
problème.
Je pense que tu parles du Japon. Enfin, je suis d'accord avec tout ce que tu as dit, mais je pense qu'il y a une chose, même avec toutes tes photos à montrer, quand même au Japon, la chose, je trouve que la plus importante, c'est quand même la subtilité de l'art. Tu as montré que tu n'as pas cité, mais je me demande, c'est grâce à ça, peut-être à cette sensibilité, cette subtilité, que ce peuple est devenu un peuple, l'harmonie. Est-ce que tu es d'accord?
Oui, oui, absolument.
Oui,
Regarde,
tu peux traduire, peut-être tu
j'ai pris
traduis.
une poignée de choses.
Peut-être.
No, I will translate. I will translate. Just hold on for 2 seconds. What he is saying is that what I missed, and which is a really important part of Japanese culture, is the subtlety of its art. And that reflects a particular way of looking at things which is quite unique for this society. And I agree with her. I just simply said, I've taken a few things that I had ready to make a general point, but yours is absolutely valid in that context, no question. That was, yeah, you wanted to.
Well, very insightful lecture. And I was very surprised to hear from you that how can I say it? Science as a social construct. Yeah. And then I'm from social science, so we take it for granted. And then whatever is interpreted is a social contract, social construction. Yeah. So, but how much this idea is shared among natural scientists? That's my first question.
Okay. I can answer that very quickly.
But
whenever I present it that way, they get very angry.
I understand. That's what I thought. But if we believe that is the same, just like social scientists believe in that, if that is the case with natural sciences, then how do you consider the replicability of some theory? that is linked with what Professor Yasunari indicated. Like we start with local knowledge, or we find out some local, we find many new things from locals. But how much we can really take it or interpret it as a universal knowledge, etc. So that is replicability. So if we stick to the idea everything is social construct, then I think we have a problem with thinking about replicability, which is a fundamental element in science, in every field.
Okay, the way I, for myself, deal with that is by basically saying the individual case studies are non-replicable. What is replicable is the meta-language and the meta-level of concepts that we actually devise to look at those phenomena. So I see basically two levels. A level of constructs, which are, in my sense, particular systemic constructs, which are theoretically replicable, and a level at which they're implemented, which is not replicable, because their cultural differences and social differences play such a huge role that we cannot simply assume any form of replicability. I mean, all of this comes, and now I refer also again to another adventure where Anique got me involved. We went to the highlands of Papua New Guinea, where she has been working for quite a while. If you look around there, things are so different that there is no way you can even begin to think about replicability with another culture. At the same time, there are a number of mechanisms by which these people live, which you can summarize in a meta-language, which is not that different from what I experienced among relatively primitive farmers in Syria, for example. So I think what we don't do often enough in social science in particular is to actually work at the construction of those meta-languages. Social sciences have a lot of, and in anthropology this is terminal. Whenever you have an argument that has any theory in it, one anthropologist will get up and say, I have a case to the contrary. And that's at the end of the discussion, because then you cannot discuss anymore. And so social scientists have a big task there. Anyway.
So I mentioned no need to worry about soup getting cold, but I just realized we have beer and wine getting warm. So I would like to draw this to a close. We will continue in the dining hall, which is across the lobby, entrance lobby, all the way to the end of the building. But to close this afternoon, I want to thank Sander again for being who he's been in the past 7 years for us, but in particular for the very stimulating discussion and today with us.
You know,
so thank you very much.
For me, it's all summarized by the fact that being here is fun.
Well, up to some more fun then.
Yeah.
Thank you.